Joseph Stiglitz's lecture at the Reserve Bank Auditorium on Monday is important because it really pulls together some of the key policy themes, both locally and internationally, that are of urgent importance. And they may at first seem to be disparate themes, but in fact his argument, and it's a hard argument at that level to refute, is that they are fundamentally connected. And the big overarching issue that pulls them all together is climate change and the relationship between dealing with climate change and economic restructuring and reform.
I think we are going to eventually get to a carbon price like $80 a ton. That will happen. And the real question is it going to come like a shock, like the crisis, like a collapse of the sudden change in price like happened in the United States real estate market? Or is it something that you're going to be working for and adapting to? And so I encourage all countries to really begin the process of adapting to a green economy quickly, and South Africa has the capacity, I think, to begin doing research, developing technology. It's already shown that it can in ways that will put it at the forefront among the emerging markets. In that way, it's not just a question of leadership, it's also a question of, I would say, business opportunity. To me, addressing the problems of climate change can be an important driver of economic growth from a global point of view, and, as I'll talk about it in a few minutes, from the perspective of a country like South Africa, emerging markets, also a driver for their economic growth and employment.
Government needs to make very clear its commitment to low carbon development. It needs to, across the whole regulatory spectrum, adopt rules that favour a move away from carbon intensive development. Then he suggests some other things. He suggests changes to the tax regime, to tax carbon for starters, but one can imagine a set of other tax incentives and so forth.
I'm an advocate of a carbon tax. Charging for the emissions of carbon is an important way, is a way of providing a price signal, giving people information that there's a cost associated with carbon emissions. In terms of the theory of taxation, it's also a very good approach, because it makes much more sense to tax bad things than good things.
Most controversial of all, however, and the comment that really hogged the headlines was around what kind of macroeconomic policy changes do you need to make to support this kind of thing. And he threw out almost casually the suggestion that really the rand should be substantially weakened.
South Africa has a particular problem that's shared by a number of others of having the good fortune of having lots of resources, but that leads to what's called the natural resource curse of a high exchange rate that leads in many parts of the world to what I call rich countries but poor people. And the phenomena of a high exchange rate, non-competitive exchange rate, means that it's hard to compete and export other job-creating sectors, compete on imports. A secondary version of beggar their neighbor policies of competitive devaluation. And the result of this is that countries all over the world have had to respond.
That's a view that's supported by some government departments, notably Patel's Department, Economic Development, and by the DTI, and by some in business, particularly exporters. It's vehemently rejected by the National Treasury. Pravin Gordhan has spoken about the risks of competitive devaluation. The Reserve Bank has very profound concerns about it. And I must admit that while I personally agree with many of the things that Stilglitz said, I really can't agree with him on that. I think it's a massive distraction to worry about intervening in the currency. I think it's highly unlikely to be successful, and that the benefits would be quite quickly eroded. The other thing that he said that I think is going to be very difficult for developing countries to swallow is that once the world has agreed to a final set of binding standards for reducing carbon, the way to enforce those standards, and effectively the way to get the US into a deal, is that the punishment for not adhering to globally agreed cuts in carbon emissions would be that those countries that don't agree would face trade sanctions. And you may well find then that the poor get punished by climate change in two ways. They get punished by being on the sharp end of the actual change. Bangladesh faces severe floods, for example. Island nations go underwater. South Africa and other similar sorts of tropical countries would face worse droughts. So developing countries are punished in that sense. And then they're punished again, potentially, because they've tried to develop using carbon-intensive technologies, and they're punished again by having their exports excluded from rich country markets. So I think that's going to be a very, very hard proposition to sell. But the critical thing is we now have this deadline and we have a sense of urgency about getting it right. In my view, there's still deep confusion in our government, though. So the first thing government needs to do is decide on its commitment to less carbon-intensive growth. And I hope that the pressure that's coming from Patel's department and helped along by someone as credible and substantial as Stilglitz will help to clarify that discussion and make sure that the market out there, the investors, the researchers understand that this is an environment in which they can make substantial commitments to green energy, to green technology of various kinds. And that is the first thing that we need if we're going to get all the other benefits that Stilglitz imagines, that the new growth path imagines, is a sense from business, from the research community, from the policy community that we know where we're going on this, and that where we're going is indeed a low carbon future, not a future fueled entirely by the dirty coal that we have so much of.
This is the largest challenge, I think, of this kind that the world has ever faced. It's a challenge where we have no choice but to rise to it.